All right, with that said, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case that will stand in their name.
Cool, thanks. So POI's in the chat, please, and just write your team code as well, so I know who's asking. Just checking that I'm audible as well. As no one said anything, I assume I am. Cool. Timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, say what the counterfactual is likely to be. Second of all, why that's worse, and then say why on the comparative it's better for you to specifically be engaging in amateur porn. First of all, why is the counterfactual likely to be traditional porn? First of all, you have teenagers specifically in the closet who are LGBT. They see and they need like porn specifically for them to be able to explore and understand their identity and things like that. Usually in very conservative countries, that's the only outlet that they can have, specifically because of algorithms and things like that. You're more likely specifically to be focusing on these sort of things, and they're more likely to come up in your search engine first and things like that. Second of all, people who are likely to be just extra marginalized, i.e. like transgender people and things like that, they're probably coerced and forced into engaging in this sort of employment because they're fetishized and things like that. And LGBT people in general are fetishized because of the uniqueness they are sort of seen to bring by white men who control these specific big corporations, things like that in the porn industry, things like Pornhub, means that they are likely to be coerced into this thing, which means that on either side, they are likely specifically to be opting into some level of porn, and I think that is really, really important. I think there are a couple of things to say why is there an inherent problem with the traditional porn industry. First of all, there is the idea of the contractual obligations. Insofar as the porn industry usually prefers young people, because that's the sort of thing that people like to watch, or i.e. people who are like under the age of 30 or things like that, you are likely specifically to not understand specifically how contracts or jobs work specifically in this industry, because this is a very unique industry that has certain like pressures and certain things like that. Therefore, you probably, when you join the industry, first of all, you're unlikely specifically to know about the things that are happening, because it's a very like, unless you are in the industry, you don't know specifically the working conditions that are going on, because society specifically tells you that society just sort of taboos it and makes it that you don't know anything about the internal workings of it, which means automatically you've got an information asymmetry about the contract specifically when you join. This is specifically compounded and even worse for closeted and LGBT people who do not have access to resources specifically, are probably forced into this job in the first place because they have nothing else, or they may not have anything else specifically to be doing, because on the comparative, doing like escort work or something outside or in person is probably likely to be even dangerous, and I don't think they'd want to specifically opt into that either. I think on the I think there are a couple of other things. First of all, that contracts will specifically force you to do the things that you don't want to do, i.e. that you do not have any creative control over the things that you pump out, because the people who direct the things are the ones who specifically tell you what you should be doing. Second of all, that even if OnlyFans and amateur porn, you have to compete against others, there is a compounded double burden on you in traditional porn. You have to compete within the company itself against people like yourself who've got digital contracts, as well as people in other porn industries. Therefore, you have to work doubly hard to make sure that you are specifically getting to the top and specifically being used, which means it's even harder for you to reach up to the top. And also there's even a cap, because they still don't like have one person doing everything, which means you can never maximize the potential that you have. Second of all, they have a profit incentive against LGBT people. Businesses are very risk averse, and they've always been long-termist, which means they always think about heteronormativity and straight porn, because that's the thing that's been there the most. They know it's tried and tested. A couple of reasons why that is the case, because on Pornhub and things like that, there's algorithmic sort of things, which means that's like sort of like a tyranny, which means you are likely not to be picked over someone who is straight, specifically for people who are starting out in smaller companies, which you're more likely to be able to get involved with, because LGBT people don't have the capital specifically to do a good interview for these companies, which means the smaller industries, the smaller companies will automatically pick like straight people to get their capital going, right? And insofar as you're LGBT, they probably want to play it safe, which means you'll automatically be used less than others. Therefore, I think that is specifically bad on their side of the house. Third of all, fetishization. You are subconsciously otherized when you are in this company, i.e. that you are compartmentalized into like into like straight people and LGBT. You are used certain times for certain specific acts and for certain specific films and porn things. People specifically see you as a novelty, even if you cannot see that is subconsciously degrading to the LGBT plus community. You automatically think that you sell yourselves a lesser. Note the framing at the start of my speech specifically about how people are opting into this, because this is the only thing they have to watch, the porn, things like that, to get their information, to be able to understand the LGBT industry. So insofar as LGBT will see that they're sort of fetishized, then they'll sort of subconsciously think that they're lesser. But second of all, the people who are straight who might fetishize you anyway probably understand that you are separate and compartmentalized, which means that it's okay specifically for them to compartmentalize you, which is not good for the LGBT community in general. And you form like parasocial relationships like that, and you form like sort of things when you see the visual aspect of this. I think this is even worse when teenagers and people who are starting out with learning about LGBT stuff, who are LGBT themselves, are watching this because they specifically have like space for their mind to grow without like forming opinions themselves, which means they're more likely to be socialized in this idea to begin with, which means it compounds and gets worse. This is a bit worse because of the heteronormative and male gaze, which forces you in these companies, because they're usually dominated by white men, for you to specifically opt into this, and you're often owned by large companies who are white men, whereas you are more likely to just be subconsciously put into this, and the contract is likely specifically to structurally reinforce that. Okay, then going on to why the amateur porn industry is specifically better for the LGBT community. First of all, even if so I think first of all, the first main point is that why does amateur porn not have the same problems, and why is it mutually exclusive? I think first of all, it gives you liberation from for you able to rework the heteronormative gaze. I mean, insofar as you're not likely to change the world, but you're able, specifically the people who interact around you, to set prices for you to specifically have your own contract. You can determine what you want to see from viewers, how much money and things like that, which means you have creative control. Before 6 is closing up, have anything? No, okay. So insofar as you have creative control, you are now specifically able to determine what the LGBTQ experience is. Insofar as white men don't fucking know what the LGBTQ experience is, and they don't know what people want to see, and you will now specifically be able to tell your story. Insofar as you are the certain person that wants to opt into amateur porn, you probably understand and know that you have something to be able to sell, which is specifically something that you are good at. Insofar as you know what the creative control is, rather than someone telling you what it is, that is better comparatively for you to be able to sell the LGBTQ experience better, which internally is better for that person, but externally for when people look at you and things like that. I think that is specifically better when you are able to do that. I think you can bite the bullet and say, look, that you may specifically get like less money, but although I don't think that is likely to be the case, I think in the ability for the LGBT community, the main thing is for you to be able to get your message out there and the lived experience that you are trying to represent. I think on the comparative, you're more likely to be able to liberate your own self, even if you are not able to reach a large amount of people, but and you are able to do that. Because on the counterfactual, you're not going to be able to reach because of the algorithms that will always prefer straight people, and you'll be used less because you're gay anyway, or LGBT, sorry, which means that you are better on the comparative, even if you get less exposure because you're able to influence the people around you. And for all those reasons, proud to propose.
Right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, and I'd like to now call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
All right, just speak up if you want to raise the UI. In opening opposition, we believe that the amateur porn scene has made it to such that this porn scene is more closer to people and more visible to them what actually happens inside. That's why our main clash is that we believe that the LGBT community should regret the rise of the amateur porn scene. We believe that this hurts the community more than it helps them. Contextualization. First, we think that historically, the LGBT community has been aggressively sexualized. This has historically hampered the capacity of the society to accept us because we are now being attached with different symbols, like sex symbols. We are seen as dirty and we are seen as sinful. We think that these particular stereotypes undermine the ability of the LGBT community to be seen as diverse, to be seen as people that should be accepted, and should be seen as people that should not be avoided. What is this debate about then? We think that we should opt into a particular action that best represents the LGBT community as a movement. And we think that the best course of action is one where we ultimately get the support and not we hate that we do not deserve. Before this, a few rebuttals first. The main argument of opening government is this idea that instead of opting into more professional porn scene like Pornhub and a lot of these bigger companies, it is better if we support the amateur porn scene because of a lot of reasons that they talked about. First thing is, we don't think that we have to support this particular professional porn scene, right? We don't have to stick by it. We don't have to stand by it. Secondly, even if we still do, we think that there's still check and balance that exists in status quo. We have seen unprecedented changes into this particular community. We have seen a lot of protections being built for these people, and we think that it's still better than we have in status quo. What is then very unique with the amateur of OnlyFans and a lot of these particular apps that lets these individuals sell their body for a few dollars ultimately made us closer, made this idea closer to the society. It visibilized this kind of work more, and it visibilized what are the things that the LGBT people do in these particular apps, right? We think this is ultimately damaging to the particular image that we want to protect as the LGBT community. I have two arguments. First, how the rise of amateur porn scene undermines the ability of the LGBT community to integrate in the greater society. And secondly, how this hurts the representation of LGBT identities amongst the movement. Firstly, we accept that there have been progresses in the ability of gays to empower themselves, like this particular porn scene, right? But we think that there's more that needs to be done, right? And I think that these are more tangible things that are important for the majority of the LGBT community. Things like access to jobs without discrimination, access to better healthcare, and access to protection and even same-sex marriage, right? We think that the trend of the increasing conservatism in Asian and even Western countries like Poland and Hungary has ultimately halted these particular moves by making the people believe that the LGBT movement is not a particular movement you want to get behind. What is then the most important interest of the community, right? We think it are more tangible things like protection and access to opportunities. But if you look at the rise of amateur porn scene, it is not something that is unequivocally embraced by the majority of the society. That's why most of them stigmatize it and call it immoral. We think that this has also intensified with the rise of these apps that made these particular jobs more accessible to a lot more people, right? The more we celebrate and embrace it, we are then more likely to be associated with an industry that the public ultimately vilifies. The public will continue to hypersexualize the community, calling us immorals and a lot of these things, right? What are the impacts of this? Firstly, it is harder then to get support in our causes because this particular bad image is just being intensified even more. We have less buy-in, and lastly, it is harder then to pass policies, right? That also means we have less support in things that actually mean to us, like funding for HIV and reproductive health, because the society can just twist the narrative against us and say that you are sick because of your own doing. We think that the best way for us to ultimately stop this particular image from happening is to showcase the diversity of the LGBT community and not ultimately wave in the faces of the people that we are a community that supports something that they do not necessarily support. Second argument, how this ultimately hurts the representation of LGBT identities amongst the movement. The OnlyFans and a lot of these amateur porn sites is built on the idea of selling bodies. And people thrive in these spaces through subscription basis. This institution is built on capitalistic structure of subscribing through more preferred types of bodies, which is usually Eurocentric in nature. When we embrace the rise of these systems, we further entrench these standards and ultimately hurt people who do not fit said standards. That means our fatter, brown people, smaller people, or those people that do not fit these preferred standards will ultimately be disenfranchised. Why? Because in these particular spaces, we glorify these bodies that we like. We glorify Eurocentric bodies that does not necessarily fit everyone. Why is this harmful for the LGBT movement? In status quo, there's already a rift happening because of these particular hierarchies, like masks are better than femmes, like other particular these particular groups, right? And we think this is heightened by the fact that most of these people with Eurocentric standards of beauty are now capitalizing on their images to get some few profits, right? That means that these people with non-Eurocentric standards of body will have a harder time trying to infiltrate the minds of these people, trying to change the perception in the society, and trying to tell people that being white does not mean being beautiful, or being colored does not mean being ugly, right? We think in these particular spaces, it is harder to pierce through, even if we have one or two people that have non-Eurocentric standards of beauty, right? Because even if there's some of them that's trying to thrive in these spaces, it is still harder to compete with a lot more people that's being supported with a lot more people that still want these Eurocentric standards of beauty. What did I prove in my speech? I firstly proved to you that this kind of support ultimately hampers our ability to be able to showcase that the LGBT movement is not something like what society painted us to be. We are something much more than that, and we are something that should be celebrated. Thanks.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker, and I'd like to now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hey, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Well, due to idiocracy going on between my government and Hamas, I'm literally speaking from a shelter. So if at any point I get disconnected, please let me know. And starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The key word in this debate, as well as
Sorry, you just
main
froze
thing
up
that
for
was
a
lacking
moment.
from leader of.
Um,
Am I audible now?
You're audible. Your video is kind of freezing.
Okay.
Was that happening for other people?
Yes, it is. Like she can switch off the video if she wants to, if it is not problematic for her.
Yeah, I don't know if that would be easier for
Let's
you or
maybe
not.
try just. No worries. Am I clearly audible, not breaking off?
I think you're more audible now. Yeah.
Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The key word in this debate, as well as the main thing lacking from leader of opposition speech, is comparative. If the motion was this house, as the LGBT community, or believes that the LGBT community should support porn in general or the industry, the speech we heard from LO would be very much relevant. Unfortunately, as already analyzed by Parth and to no rebuttal, porn would exist on both sides of the debate. 3 crucial reasons as to why we think porn, and specifically queer porn, would be rampant either way. A, the fact is generally porn is extremely popular amongst humans. Broadly speaking, we know from the status quo and from history that porn is extremely popular and viewed by most people. Secondly, specifically LGBT people who tend to be more in the closet, especially in their young formative years, have often no other avenue in order to actually fulfill their sexual desires. So their only way to do it is through porn, in hiding in their room with the door locked. So it's even more likely to be common. Thirdly, the fact that LGBT people suffer from both sexualization, fetishization, like LO said, and unemployment, making them pressured to work in the porn industry on both sides of the debate. No response to this from LO. We think that extremely likely on both sides of the debate, we'd have a lot of queer porn, a lot of people working in it, a lot of people watching it. The only difference is how it would happen. Therefore, 2 main questions in this debate. A, which kind of porn is better for the workers? B, which kind of porn is better for the viewers? And one point of framing here, which is also important, we get choice, because note, Pornhub didn't disappear. The traditional porn industry didn't disappear. So if at any point opposition does analyze that there is any advantage to the traditional porn industry, we also get to accrue it. We have choice for people to choose what they prefer to watch and where they prefer to work. They defend a world in which we have only one option. Awesome. Let's get to the questions in this one by one. Firstly, what is better for the workers? Again, a lot of this already analyzed by Parth to no engagement. Firstly, in terms of choice, we think that the ability to choose and opt into the things you do when you have your own personalized account of OnlyFans or whatnot is much, much larger. Why is that? Because you can have much more of an opt-out whenever you want. You don't sign a contract which you are legally bound to and need to pay some sort of a payback if you violate your contract when you're a young teen that don't know yet exactly what you're signing into when you're in your early 20s. But secondly, the existence of more ability to choose case by case what you want and what you don't want to do. Because here's the thing, when you have an employer or a producer in the industry, you get a bundle deal. You know that if you refuse to do one thing, if this is your hard limit, you might not just lose the revenue for this one video, you might lose your job altogether. You can be fired for this. Your employer can pressure you in this manner. Whereas when you choose your own terms of employment, when you make your own account, you can choose to do some things and not others. You can make your own limits, and you know that no one can fire you just because you put your limit at one specific thing that you will not do. Secondly, the fact that you are much less based on having many views, because the algorithm of Pornhub and the way it works is a way in which most people don't pay, but rather it gets on advertisements, and only a few people pay for the bonus videos, right? Meaning that you need to cater to a huge audience, including many straight people who will fetishize you, such as in lesbian porn or for transgender individuals, etc., who get fetishized by straight men very often. And just generally, it forces you to do many things that you wouldn't want to do, because this is the only way for you to get revenue. This is also exasperated by the fact that you only get a portion of your profit, because a big part of it goes to the producer as opposed to you. When you produce your own content, A, you can keep 100% of the revenue to yourself, but B, every participant pays. This is the model for OnlyFans, meaning that you can have a smaller audience, people who want the kind of things you do, just lesbians selling for other lesbians, and can still make ends meet by this manner. Thirdly, the fact that it's much safer. Employers can make many things to pressure you, such as, I don't know, reveal your identity to the world, which is something that every porn actor is afraid of, but specifically people who are LGBT and often in the closet. When you create your own content, you know that you're safe and no one can extort you to do things you don't want to. So much better for the workers. What about the message that it sends to the viewers, the LGBT teenagers who learn from this about the experience of same sex? Firstly, we think that it is just the fact that it is produced by the creators themselves makes it much better. Note how this also engages the very uncomparative case by LO, because LO tells us, fetishization and much more sexualization, and people think that it is bad. Yes, but this is much more true when you have it in the traditional porn industry, when you have it catered to exactly fetishization by the people, as opposed to what individuals want to produce and want to watch, with much more boundaries, with much less fetishization involved in this. But secondly, we think that the fact that there's less of an algorithm that pumps to you the most popular content, which is usually the content that is viewed by other heterosexual people because they are the larger audience. And two, the fact that you have things that are much less likely to be objectifying, because you can control the comment section, you can monitor for people to not write bad comments, and because there's more of a personal attachment and connection between the actors and the viewers, because it's such a small target audience which pays you directly, making them much less likely to objectify you. Thirdly, the fact that it is much more, real people, less likely to be prone to photoshops and models, etc., because you produce your own thing, meaning that exactly the things that opening opposition describes about, having one type of body that is good, only people who are white, only people who are young, only people who are classified as traditionally twink or stud, and nothing in between, is something that happens much more in the traditional porn industry, when they actually have Photoshop involved and models, etc., as opposed to real people just filming themselves and their own lives. So we think all of this is better. Lastly, on the message that it sends also to heterosexual people who are exposed to this. Here, other than the many things I said about, many of the things I said about the message to kids being relevant here as well, there's also the message, all of this applies also to the heterosexual audience, but in addition, just a few mitigations to the material that we got from Leader of Opposition. We think that people in the LGBT population will be sexualized anyway and perceived as hypersexual anyway, because people perceive it to be about sex. It's literally your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. B, because pride events tend to be hypersexualized. And C, because of more rampant HIV among the LGBT population, as well as just more promiscuity, because if you already go over one barrier of society judging you, you're more likely to go over other barriers and become more promiscuous. So we think this has no delta. The other things do beg you to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker. Hope things are all right there. I heard the alarm going off briefly towards the end of that. Stay safe. All right, I'd like to thank the speaker and now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
You are.
Okay. I think that opening government failed to look at the fact that the rise of these amateur porn industries have ultimately shaken status quo, and it made it more apparent, or the existence of these particular jobs apparent, right? The first thing that they said is this idea that, porn would still exist in both sides. So the harms are just symmetric. The first response to this is by extents. I argued to you how the existence of OnlyFans, coupled with the fact that it became famous in TikTok and Twitter, has ultimately made this particular idea more apparent. Secondly, it ultimately were worsened by the fact that OnlyFans became more accessible to LGBT people that wants to have access to these particular jobs. So the immediate thing that happened is that a lot of these particular LGBT people that have more Eurocentric facial structures or bodies have ultimately gained so much easier access to these particular things, right? I would agree that the porn industry is also not perfect, and it's something that is also regrettable. But we think that without the existence of these particular amateur porn industries, this particular idea of the sexualization of LGBT individuals is so much more controllable under these professional spaces, right? But we have made it so that the sex work is ultimately becoming more accessible and becoming more apparent to the society, that anyone, even their children, can opt into this particular industry and can ultimately harm their family, right? I'm going to extend this particular case on how this industry ultimately boxed LGBT individuals into sex work, even if majority of them do not necessarily want to opt into these things. The first thing is that, and I argued to you earlier, that most of these people that have access to OnlyFans are people with Eurocentric features, like mask in men or fen in women, right? A lot of these people are also the people that are crucial in the LGBT community in fighting for better access to jobs or better access for opportunity. Why is this so? Because in this racist and sexist society, people are more likely to listen to straight white men that are ultimately more powerful in their eyes, right? But given that, with the rise of these amateur porn industry, we have made it so as a society that if you do not have job or if you do not have access to opportunities, you can just opt into OnlyFans and try to get by there. That means majority of these particular people that should have been the voice of the LGBT community are now choosing to just stay in status quo and not ultimately fight for better rights. We have seen this in times of pandemic, where a lot of people lost their jobs because of companies closing, or just because of the recession, right? A lot of these people opted into OnlyFans and are now letting go of the other LGBT members that do not have this particular access because they don't have the body features that are more applicable in OnlyFans, right? That means in opening government, you are letting go of these minority LGBT individuals who do not necessarily have the the will to actually work in OnlyFans or have access to this kind of job, right? So sure, even if it's true that these particular individuals are worse off in the professional porn industry, and they ultimately will not have that particular access to job, we think that they're not the most vulnerable actors in this debate, especially when you have more minority LGBT individuals that needs actual actions from these Western LGBT community to make them speak for them, or to make them do something to give particular access to jobs for these LGBT individuals. We think that we have also created a culture of just forcing LGBT individuals to accept the being promiscuous, or being able to work in this particular field, even if it's not necessarily accepted by everyone else, right? So even in the worst case that we don't have this particular option, and these white gays can only work in the professional porn industry, we think that we're still better off with that, rather than creating a society that has ultimately picture painted LGBT community as a promiscuous group of people that are out to sin and are out to destroy the lives of children in our particular country, right? We think that the exclusive harm of ultimately degrading the image of the LGBT community will not exist in a world where we did not celebrate this particular new access to amateur porn that has made it look like the LGBT community's only job is being a sex worker that is not necessarily accepted by the whole, the entire society. I'll take a POI at this point.
Given porn and LGBT porn being extremely popular on both sides of the debate, and given all the many other reasons LGBT people are sexualized anyway, what's the significant delta of OnlyFans on this?
Yeah, because of the extent of harm that we create, right? Before, the porn industry is not on the front line of the work or the job that the LGBT community can take. But now, when people are jobless on Twitter or TikTok, people just say that you have to go to OnlyFans, you can get money there. We think that even if this is true for some people, especially Western LGBT people, we think that this is not entirely true with a lot more people. And coupled with the fact that this ultimately has created great news and has reached a lot more people, especially conservative one, and proved to them and ultimately just agreed to the idea that a lot of these LGBT people are ultimately promiscuous and bad for the society, right? A lot of the impacts that we talked about are things that are ultimately tangible to the people. When we continue this culture of making it look like the LGBT community is about sex work and about things that the society does not necessarily agree to, there are a lot of things that we will lose, especially now in times of pandemic when a lot of us have needs, right? We think if we're able to trade off these particular LGBT people that might lose job in the sex work industry, it's fine if we trade this off, because this debate works in prioritizing the most vulnerable individuals. And we think that these gays on OnlyFans that have a lot of money because they are certainly hot and white do not necessarily fit into the standard of very vulnerable. For that, we think that we should oppose things.
I'd like to thank the speaker, and I'd like to now call upon the member of government.
Please POI me by turning on your videos and waving. If you can't do that, I'll also accept POIs by unmuting and saying POI. I don't use the female pronouns. Our extension is going to be about viewers and why LGBTQ+ community as a whole really benefits from the rise of amateur porn. Before I dive into it, 3 reasons why we outweigh OG's main contribution on performers. The first is because of non-uniqueness, i.e., I think there are very good reasons why the problems that they identified with how oppressive and exploitative the conventional porn industry can be of its employees is true not just of gay porn and LGBTQ+ porn, but of porn everywhere. And I think there are good reasons why they're increasing protections for them, irrespective of the rise of amateur porn. First, because there's often destigmatization in sex work overall, which means that sex workers feel much more comfortable in talking about the issues they face and looking for legislation. But two, because I would posit that the increasing amount of visibility also means that there are increasing degrees of unionization, which means that sex workers are often finding abilities to support one another. But finally, because I just also want to say that we honestly don't think that the number of sex workers is that massive, i.e., we think lots of people do it, yes, but in the grand scheme of things, it's probably about like 1 in 100, if not 200. And I just think that relatively speaking, way more people consume that porn and are affected in terms of their self-esteem, their happiness on a day-to-day basis on that porn. And I think that's why we're gonna win in terms of impact. Before that, one small piece of rebuttal to the OO case, which is mostly about how porn causes the straight people to view us and as more promiscuous. I just want to observe that there's a very strong public-private divide between porn and the rest of public life. That is that even if a person sees gay porn and says, this is kind of jank, even though I think that's honestly kind of unlikely because you're not going to click into it and watch the whole thing if you're not really into it. You're not going to go around talking about it or really internalizing it. Because I think for most people, the things that you see when you're guiltily watching porn is not things that you then discuss with your friends. And it's something that is still quite isolated. But the second thing I want to observe is just that it's impossible for the LGBTQ plus community to make any progress whatsoever if you're trying to deny the fact that what makes you different from a large proportion of cishet straight people is fundamentally about sexuality and the things you prefer, because in doing so, you're forcing a large number of people to just suppress a vital part of your identity. So for those reasons, I genuinely think it's okay to risk being seen as promiscuous in order to attain more benefits. Okay, so extension. The rise of amateur pornography is really great because what it looks like is a flood in plentiful and diverse content onto social media, which vastly increases the quality of life of most people. Analysis for this. The first reason is because people's sexual preferences are incredibly diverse. And this clashes directly with the OO complaint about how this excludes Black, brown, fat bodies, for example. That is, that even the public sphere, maybe Eurocentric features are preferred. At the end of the day, we often don't have control over who we're sexually attracted to, and that creates a huge diversity, not just in kinks, but also in a perception of what bodies we find attractive. The amateur porn industry has meant that people like bears, people who are like silver foxes, for example, and therefore older, just all sorts of bodies are now seen as more attractive. And the fact that there are so many different preferences also means that there's a huge amount of diversity in supply. But second of all, it's also just the case that there's a substantially higher number of people who are willing to produce porn because the barrier for production is often low compared to a very high return. That is, that one, there are droves of gay men, for example, who just derive sexual pleasure from uploading videos of themselves onto the internet for other people that they're potentially sexually attracted to consume. But second of all, there are also just women who do things such as create voiceovers because having other girls who you're attracted to provide validation and praise is something that also gives you pleasure. But finally, I also want to say comparatively, studios often have a very limited capacity because they're often, one, you have to pay performers, but also because there are limited returns to producing more content versus advertising what you already have. The end conclusion of this is that we get way more content, and that's a net good in and of itself because suppliers are often very diverse, which means that this huge amount of different content chips away at the cishet conception of sexuality about what you should behave like in a bedroom, which benefits not just the LGBTQ plus community, but also women and other people. But finally, I also just think it's really important because it becomes an increasingly dominant market-making force in pornography, which compels conventional actors and producers of pornography to also change their behavior and treat their performers better so they don't immediately cut the contract after they finish this one term because they realize they can make the same amount of money on OnlyFans or making amateur videos on Pornhub, which is a huge depository of amateur porn, guys. But why is it important? Because I think that contribution beats our top half because one, we explain why the opportunity is available to all bodies, but second of all, because we help not just prospective gay people who are interested in joining the LGBT producing content, but also people who are currently trapped within conventional producing studios who now have their bosses change the ways in which they treat them, which means that we actually make sure that we get positive changes for them too. But then, why is it that the availability of this content just means that LGBTQ plus people are really, really better off? The first reason is because it normalizes LGBTQ plus people and porn, i.e., irrespective of whether you're going to watch it or not, the rise of amateur porn means that you are a lot more aware of LGBTQ plus people, because the pornography is on the rising top 10 hot videos on Pornhub or X-Hamster or whatever, and that means that it occupies a significant amount of space. That's important because I want to observe that porn producers are different to porn platformers. Porn platformers don't have strong incentives when it comes to who am I gonna support? Because oftentimes I'm just totally disconnected from porn producers, and I just want to make sure that whatever porn is going to be the most attractive and get the most amount of clicks rises up in terms of popularity, and the algorithm favors that amount of porn as well. That's really, really ideal, because that means, and it's really ideal that porn is a space in which we show people there are a large number of queer people, because this is a very, very private space. Your intuitive reaction is not to apply what you think the socially acceptable reaction is, but rather to genuinely think about this, because this is something that you talk about. But second of all, queer people come out way, way more, and more people become bi-curious. That is because if you see things more and you're more willing to watch things, you then realize things about your sexuality that you otherwise wouldn't have done so because you previously didn't conceive of yourself as queer. That's important because oftentimes these bi-curious and heteroflexible people are people in relative positions of privilege. Bi guys, for example, who are able to get away with dating women and pass as straight and privileged in society. I think having them on our side is really, really important to acquire equality and visibility. Very happy to propose.
All right, I'm just going to pour some more caffeine from my soda, and then I will call upon the member of opposition. All right.
Great. For a second, I thought you were pouring coffee into your soda.
No,
really confusing.
I'm not a coffee person, which means I have to drink a lot more to get the same impact.
I mean, whatever works. Okay. I prefer to take POIs visually, but if not, I'll take them in the chat, just preferably not verbally. The rise of amateur porn scene is not just people being more free or public with their sexual preferences. The amateur porn scene and stuff that exists on OnlyFans is still business. It is still people who are seeking profit, who are doing porn for likely the same reasons that they did before. So what we're going to talk about on closing opposition is specifically why the audience changes and how it's not the porn itself that changes, but rather the packaging and the way that it's perceived and the relationships that people form with porn, why those are negative and why that leads to more glamorization and unrealistic expectations that are internalized by gay people who are viewing this porn. That's going to be the difference on closing opposition. We're not really going to focus on the ability for creators to do stuff. We're going to focus on the impacts that it has on people who are viewing and why that relationship necessarily changes via amateur porn platforms. So I'm going to present like one big case with integrated refutations, starting off with how people engage the amateur porn scene, why that changes, and why that's ultimately bad. So firstly, how do people engage with the amateur porn scene, and particularly like subscription services and stuff like that are more similar to OnlyFans and traditional porn services like websites like Pornhub? So we would say that the porn itself is not different. The only difference is its packaging and who consumes it. The reason for this is because the same markets for people who are consuming porn still exist on either side, and that's why content is going to be rather similar, as people are either seeking profit or income. Like on either side of the house, they're still looking to cater to the same groups of people who are paying money, or these are people who are already finding spaces to create porn and are likely to do so on either side of the house. So that's to say, stuff about like heteronormativity and creating porn that's targeted towards straight people is likely to be symmetric on either side, as long as that market continues to exist. So I'm going to talk about the comparative then. We would say that it's unlikely to be what government kind of proposes it is from opening government, which is we don't think that people who like in a world without OnlyFans, I don't think that you have like a massive number of people who are going to be in traditional porn. Like that's not the change in this debate. It's not a zero-sum game. So I would say that the degree of harm that they're talking about isn't actually going to be as big as they say. So as to say, people who go into traditional porn probably do so similarly on either side, given that traditional porn does things like if you sign to a label, it gives you stuff like steady incomes, it gives you a manager, it gives you a guaranteed platform, in the same way that like not all music artists are freelancers. Even with the rise of Spotify and SoundCloud, signing to a label gives you specific benefits that are likely to exist on either side. And so the traditional porn scene is likely to be very, very similar. But also I would say that people already post on amateur porn communities or whatever on Pornhub and stuff like that. And so government needed to show why the audience changes and why that relationship changes and becomes better on their side of the house. Otherwise, they're the same market forces still acting and influencing what kind of content is being created. This refutation and this framing of the round clashes with the heteronormativity argument because that's likely to be symmetrical, but also clashes with the CG stuff about diversity, which also likely opposes on, which is likely the same on either side. No, thank you to the POI. I would say that in response to the CG case, diverse creators are not implied with just a net rise in volume, right? Because people only like still do stuff in response to profit, which is determined by the market demographic and just unlikely to change. But I also think that it's true that people like are on OnlyFans still in response to profit. Otherwise, they were likely to do porn stuff before the rise of these new platforms anyways, and so they wouldn't be included in the debate. But why is this going to change? Like, what is the change in this debate then? I think that OnlyFans is viewed as a much more personal exchange, or like personal platforms like that, the new stuff that's being rising. That stuff is viewed as a much more personal exchange, where no thank you to the POI, where you pay individual creators for access and form an ongoing viewership that is related to that individual, as opposed to just having pornographic content. I think that on OnlyFans, creators create much more unique personalities, and they're like more unique and personal, and like personal seeming marketing in order to attract people to their platform specifically. So that's to say, viewers are much more invested in individuals as opposed to like certain aspects of porn. So it's not about like, oh, what kind of porn do I like to watch? Now, when you have a limited amount of money and you can't just like subscribe to everyone and look for any sort of videos that you find appealing, like people have a limited number of money, like limited amount of money, choose their subscription. So it's now no longer, I like to watch a certain type of porn, but instead it's, I like this creator and what they specifically put out, that's why I'm going to subscribe and give my money to one specific person. I also think that in response to like the OG case at this point, I think that that's also why it's not necessarily like less competitive than traditional porn, like OG says, because like now that you're subscribing to only a few people, you probably want people who are like a one-man show that can basically do everything and like satisfy all of your needs or all of the desires of things that you want to see. And so I think it actually gets a little bit more competitive that way, and that you can't really capitalize on like one specific thing that you're good at. But anyways, why is it bad if this relationship becomes very personalized from the viewer side? That is because this personalization of the relationship from the viewer is not met by a symmetric increase in personalization by the creator. So that's to say, the creators are still selling content. They still need to be unrealistically great and appealing to make money, right? So we would say that the expectations for porn and what that is supposed to look like is still decided by the viewers in the market, and it's not controlled by creators. So even if creators have more ability to choose what content they put out, it's still likely to be influenced by what people want to see. So insofar as people still want to see like bodies that conform to like traditional beauty standards because that's what they believe is desirable, that content is still going to exist, and that's still going to be the most prominent. So we would say that this, that like the content is still going to be much less real. And this is just also true implicitly wherein current porn markets don't go after an audience because it's not preferable. So like where this demand exists on equal sides, it doesn't like, it's not met. And so that's why it's unlikely to be met in terms of like OnlyFans and like the amateur porn scene as well. This is bad because viewers see a much more glamorized version of like non-het sexuality basically, and internalize those expectations. So they're seeing creators that they think are much more similar to them, that they believe are much more authentic, and yet they are not seeing a more accurate representation or authentic representation of what like gay people look like basically. I think it's very harmful to view yourself in that way, in like a very primarily sexual way, or in a way that severely limits your expression just because you've internalized a lot more expectations. The media that you consume is very important because, like CG said, it's like people are often very private about their sexual preferences, especially initially. They don't talk to others about it much. And there's also not that much diverse media that you can turn to otherwise. And that's why the amateur porn scene has such a large impact. This is different from the stuff that we heard about opening opposition about beauty standards, because first of all, we showed mutual exclusivity as to why this internalization is not the same in terms of traditional porn, because it's not the same relationship you have with the stuff that you're watching. But also, I think that an internal understanding of yourself is probably a lot more important than an external perception. And even if external perception is important, it's probably still harmful to like conform to external standards. We'd rather have like conservative old white men just like basically get off our case, as opposed to like trying to conform to what old white men want in order to get them to like vote vote for LGBT rights, right? So on our side of the house, we showed you a world where people have a healthier like expectation of porn and use porn simply for what it was originally intended for, as opposed to like a role model or something that they should internalize about how they should act and behave. Very proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker, and I'd like to now call upon the government whip.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think a really weird thing that the opposition has failed to understand in this debate is that when you Google pornography, you aren't necessarily looking for what society tells you is most attractive. You're instead looking for what you as an individual finds most attractive. I think this is an important distinction because the reason why overall we grow up to find white bodies that are very skinny, that oftentimes are very Eurocentric, most attractive isn't because we all are innately attracted to like the ideal German European lady. It is more because we are constantly fed that content and told that that is the standard we should achieve. When instead individuals are able to, in private, without being pushed down by what society tells them they should be into, but rather have the capacity to explore, they have the ability to find diversity, to find what they find most attractive. I think that happens more in amateur porn spaces than when you have old white men that have been in porn for 40 years determining what content should be fed to everyone. 3 things that I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, about diversity in porn and we get more of it. Second, about LGBT acceptance and why our extension beats are opening. And lastly, about the industry of porn and why we think we change that for the better. Firstly, on diversity in porn. Overall, opening opposition starts by saying that, you're going to get more Eurocentric beauty standards. I'm really unclear as to why that is true and why that is not and why it is better when you have porn companies producing. I think that OG is already beating this argument because OG tells you that overall, when you're a porn studio, you have to cater to the average viewer. And therefore, you have to sort of lay out what you think the vast majority of people will find attractive. So you oftentimes end up going for more generalized perspectives of what LGBT people look like, of what people find attractive in women or in men. I think that in addition to that, Schalke tells you why it is that producers also oftentimes just don't understand the market because they aren't LGBTQ in many situations, given that when they open the studio or whatever, it's probably very likely that LGBT people weren't as accepted, but also because they just don't think that the market exists and they don't want to spend that much money opening like a new studio with new lights, new performers, new cameras, if they don't think that LGBT people are going to consume that content. I think this is really, really important, right? Because the thing that these studios need is essentially proof of concept. Kind of how Marvel and DC were not making any superhero-led female movies until Wonder Woman happened. And then they were like, wait, we actually can make loads of money from this. In the same way, once the producers are shown that LGBT people do actually want to consume pornography and that there's quite a lot of amateur porn that's making money, they're more likely to alter their behavior and change and obtain money in that way. Here's the important thing, right? Now we have the capacity for people to have more diverse pornography out there, not just LGBTQ porn that is not fetishized, but also LGBT porn that comes packaged in different ways. Maybe your market is that you're just a lesbian that likes to bake because that's kind of attractive, or at least I think so, and you just bake naked and your followers can pay you to bake different treats. Maybe you're just like a trans person who just chooses to live their life and occasionally masturbate on OnlyFans. And I think that that's really, really important because it means that you open the diversity of porn. This is important because you as an OnlyFans performer aren't funding an entire studio. So at most you can just have like 100 people that subscribe to you and occasionally send you money. And I think this is important because at the end of the day, it means that there's more diversity in the content that's awarded because it isn't just old studio producers determining what you want. As Schalke tells you, when you look at porn, you aren't necessarily just looking for the things that people tell you should be attractive. It is you in your own private space clicking on something because you think that you might be into that. And that's important because then you're less likely to just go for the Scarlett Johansson lookalike and more likely to go for things that you actually find more attracted. I think this is important because at the end of the day, it means that studios get proof of concept and they're also more likely to change in a better way. I think therefore this is high impact because it provides more diversity of pornography to LGBT communities that we represent, but also to studios overall. Second thing that I want to talk about, LGBT acceptance. This also, I think, responds quite well to the whole thing that closing opposition gives us. I don't think that it actually gives you unrealistic perceptions of what it is to queer, because I think that productions like porn productions tend to be way more overproduced. There are people who have like 6-packs, and I haven't met a single gay person. Maybe actually that's not true. But you know, it's very rare to find people who have 6-packs. I certainly don't have any. So I think that at the end of the day, you get that more when you watch conventional porn than when you watch, you know, people like you and me who just kind of live their lives and have an OnlyFans as well. So I think that you get more realistic perspective what it is to be queer. And I think that leads me well into LGBT acceptance. And look, we're not saying that this is going to revolutionize LGBT movements and give everyone rights, but I do think that it pushes the delta, I guess, slightly more towards the edge of change. I think this happens for 2 reasons. Firstly, because you're more likely to accept yourself. I think that part of the problem with LGBT individuals feeling sort of shame and disgust of themselves is because their sexuality always gets associated with things that are taboo or that are dirty. And I think that that's very different when it's not just a performer, right? That you don't even know the sexuality of because they're being paid to act, but rather it's a queer individual that just is on OnlyFans because they find that enjoyable and they find that they're exploring their sexuality in this way is pleasurable to them. And this is huge, right? The reason why it has to be amateur porn is because it is important that it's a common person like you and I, rather than just a porn star that is paid to act, that could be straight, but could just be paid to make out with a woman. And I think that important difference there is that you then feel more comfortable with your own sexuality when you see other people also being comfortable. The second thing is that I actually think that you get more like, ooh, this is dirty when you see less of it because it's taboo. Like people find men kissing men really dirty and gross, not because it's like actually dirty, but rather because they don't see it all the time in their everyday lives. That happens less when you get more diversity of content. So I think you're more likely to accept yourself or at least embrace your sexuality when you see other individuals doing that in that way. But secondly, I think you also get more social acceptance. I don't think that at the end of the day, you're gonna like, this is not gonna be the thing that makes everyone thinks that LGBT society, that LGBT communities are dirty, right? I think that happens already. And we can't all be like the dream gay couple that lives in the suburbs and adopts a child. I think that's unrealistic. And we need to support individuals that don't fit within that conundrum. And I think this is the important thing. It's not the only policy that the LGBT movement is going to get behind. So it's not the thing that's going to recognize them. But importantly, it is going to be something that, you know, more individuals are going to realize that these are preferences that exist and that are out in the world. When you have more like gay people kissing gay people on the street, then people start being so offended when they see one. When you also see more preferences being displayed in places like OnlyFans, you're less likely to be so outraged by them and find them dirty because you don't find them taboo anymore. So I think that overall, it leads to more acceptance. Lastly, when changing the industry, I think that we also have the capacity to influence the industry because on both sides it exists and in both sides it kind of sucks. But in ours, at least they get to compete not just against each other, but also they have to show that they're better than performers and that they can provide a contract that is better than the performer basically going at it on their own. I think that at the end of the day, we have a positive delta for acceptance, we have a positive delta for diversity, and we also have the capacity to change an industry that otherwise would refuse to budge. Very proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker. To close out the debate, I'd like to now call upon the opposition whip.
I got to do my obligatory, am I audible?
Yep.
Beautiful. Wait, sorry, I need to untangle my headphones. Give me a moment. Panel, there's nothing that I love to do more than talk about gay porn alone in my room. at 7 in the morning, incredibly proud to oppose. So I want to do a couple things in this speech, but I first want to start off with a comparative in 3 different ways. Firstly, in terms of the type and content of porn that is produced and put onto the market. Secondly, in terms of choice in porn, that you have, the choice that individual performers and people making porn have. And thirdly, about market size and whether the market really is static. After that, I want to talk about my partner's beautiful extension and how it wins this round. Firstly, in terms of the type and content of porn that is produced, this is going to engage heavily with CG, but also parts of OG. I think it's really, really important for this extension to work, because what my partner Bobby does for you is they explain why the kinds of porn that are likely to produce is going to be the same on either side of the house. Why is this the case? It's because porn is porn and people have expectations for what porn is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to be. Note that OnlyFans and often other types of amateur porn is usually not your entry point. You resort to more mainstream forms of porn since that's what you consider the most familiar, that's what is considered the most standard. But additionally, it's because it's free, right? Note that a lot of amateur labels or amateur people who are trying to make a profit can't afford to sell their porn for free because they just don't get that many views, right? They're not a big label who can collect millions and millions of views every single day, right? So note that free porn is often dominated by mainstream labels, and that is going to be your entry point of access. That is going to form your expectations for what porn ought to look like, and thus form expectations on the market in terms of what the market wants to see in the future. We even hear this from government whip when they talk about how our expectations and what we're attracted to, how that's affected by what we see and what we're socially conditioned to do. Given that your entry point and what you believe to be is attractive and what porn should be like is shaped very early on by mainstream porn, we see those expectations are also likely to be placed on individual amateur performers as well, right? Yes, you have no control over what you're attracted to, maybe in some sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that porn becomes more diverse. We still think that porn is going to be dictated by the majority, and that's probably in this case going to be straight people fetishizing the queer community, as unfortunate as that is. And note that when you as an independent creator realize that you're not actually profiting off of your niche because it's a small niche and you're an independent creator, we don't that's the point at which you either change your strategy or just simply don't do this anymore because you're not actually making money off of this. We'd say that often these niches, the kinds of creative and diverse areas that both government teams want to talk about, is captured by porn labels. The reason why is because they are the only ones who are actually have the money to invest into those niches, right? They're the ones who are able to capture large market shares, and they already have so. So the niches that do exist have largely been captured by labels. We don't think that individuals are likely to break into those markets, even if they do see somewhat of a future in themselves, and even if that market does somewhat exist. As an independent creator, you're unlikely to make that much money from it, given that you don't really have wide marketing channels. People don't know who you are. It's simply difficult to break into. So you find yourself needing to appeal to the majority, right? No, thank you to the POI. I'll take one from OG at around 5 minutes. Sorry, CG. So that's why we think it's, in fact, actually, it's not individuals who are able to explore the niches because of low access points, because at the end of the day, they are more prone to the whims of the market because they don't have the power to expand the market or expand niches in the market themselves. That's something that we think is incredibly, incredibly important. Lastly, just engaging with some stuff from CG in terms of being able to see this porn makes you more okay with, straight people being better allies, right? If you don't seek out this kind of porn, why are you going to be exposed to it necessarily? So we don't necessarily see broader society becoming more exposed, because I don't think they're going to pay for an OnlyFans subscription to porn that they're simply not attracted to. And it's unclear, even given the material we get from the member of government, why people are going to watch through all these videos or let themselves become normalized to this kind of porn if that's not something they're interested in to begin with. So that's why we think the type and content of porn is likely to remain relatively static on either side of the house. Secondly, in terms of choice in porn, right? So member of government surprisingly took lots of my refutation here, but I'll try my best not to sound derivative of my of the team across from me. Firstly, in terms of creative control, this is engaging more with the stuff that we get from opening government, right? We'd say that your creative control, as we said earlier, is largely determined by the market. And this is especially true for amateur performers who don't really have the ability to break into new niches as well, since they're not as known and they just don't have that many people who are going to look at them, right? People who search up for amateur porn often look for, categories that are widely known. Secondly, in terms of choosing between, you have a choice, and choice is important. We say that this choice already exists, even if that's smaller. Amateur porn still exists on our side of the house, or we'd still support it. It's just that it doesn't become as big and pronounced as it is on government side of the house. So you still have some of that choice, even if it's not as prominent or not as available. We think that this mitigates some of the material, right? We also want to say, what did I write here? Oh, yeah. Lastly, in terms of exploitative and bad labels, right? What I want to say here is that I think that just because, there's a prominent frame we get from both gov teams that, labels are terrible and they're run by these stupid white men who are awful, right? We say that good labels exist too, right? If you do a quick Google search, which I definitely did not do, just disclaimer, I just watch a lot of porn, don't worry about it. There are a lot of labels that actually are committed to producing ethical porn because people realize that there are problems in the porn industry, right? We also think that it's possible that good labels pop up later, especially if people become more invested in queer porn, as both government teams indicate. We think that a lot of these labels are likely to pop up in the future. And note that it's not that hard for them to pop up because platforms for porn already exist and they're not restrictive in the kinds of porn that are allowed to be posted on there. Before I move on, I'll take a quick POI from OG.
We showed that the difference is in the industry you have actors of a specific body type and Photoshop, as well as why in the first place it is likely that the counterfactual would be traditional porn, which CG is contingent on.
So I just don't know why people aren't going to Photoshop themselves on OnlyFans, or why those kind of expectations aren't also going to be placed on individual amateur performers, right? So you haven't really explained why those expectations change. And given that individual creators are more at the mercy of whims of what expectations and what the market demands, we think that those are equally, if not more, going to be put on them, right? Lastly, on market size, I just think a lot of people who are willing to do OnlyFans wouldn't be willing to do traditional porn. So I think a lot of the people who are doing amateur porn wouldn't be doing porn on either side of the house. So I don't think it's necessarily everyone who's doing amateur porn would be doing traditional porn on government side of the house. Lastly, talking about my partner's beautiful extension, because they talk about how porn it changes how people interact with porn, and this then changes your expectations and narratives, right? It's that you perceive this porn as more personal and more revealing and more indicative of what queer people are actually like. And the reason why this is really important in the round is because it weaponizes a lot of what we get out of opening opposition. It explains to us why the kinds of fetishization and sexualization that we see are exclusively harmful with amateur porn, because the way that people perceive it then becomes, they associate that much more closely with queer people instead of the kind of distancing that we like to see the status quo. Incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speakers and invite you to set up the room while the judges discuss, and we will call you back in about 15 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.